This is video 3 in a free 9-part video series showing you how to get started on your very first tender. We're just going to jump straight to it, and I'm going to walk you through a typical request to tender, request for proposals, or invitation to tender document. And I'm going to show you the things that I look for and what they all mean. So before we start, there's 3 things that are true about all request documents. Firstly, every company has their own, so they look different in layout, content, and style. Secondly, each company reuses their own template, so it will always have the same layout, key content, and style for that company. So once you've responded to one, the next one that you get, it will look very, very similar. And thirdly, each request document contains the same basic key information. So I'm just going to walk you through this one. They should have a table of contents somewhere. And if you go to the introduction, this should have a background. Somewhere you should have a background to the actual tender itself, why that company's gone out to the market, and a little bit about the context in which the works or services or goods will be provided. I tend to jump straight to the conditions of tendering because that has some very key information around how to respond to the document. If you don't follow the conditions of tendering, if you breach them in any way, you could be deemed to be non-compliant. So they're super important. Somewhere in here will be the closing date and time. Sometimes they put it on the front page or in the inside the front page, which is handy because that's second to what they want. That's actually the most important thing you need to know at this point in time, because it tells you how long you've got to actually respond. So it'll be in here somewhere in the conditions of tendering, and there it is. In this case, they've given us a timetable, so they're telling us all of the various important timeframes that you need to comply. Make sure that you pay attention to the closing time on the closing date, because especially with government, if you are half a minute late, they'll reject your tender. And some government jurisdictions have to, because that's enshrined in legislation. They can't accept a late tender, and half a minute late, that's a late tender. So make sure that you leave yourself plenty of time when you are submitting. The other thing that I look at is how they actually want it to be submitted, and I always breathe a sigh of relief if they want it submitted electronically. And more companies are going that way. That gives you a whole extra day. If they want it printed and submitted in hard copy, sometimes that means that you have to print it out and then put it in the mail, because it's going interstate or even overseas. But even if it's just being submitted locally, you've still got to print it, and then after you've printed, you see mistakes, so you send it to the printer again, and then you have to get in the car and beat the traffic and get in there and get it into the tender box before the tender closes. So submitting electronically is definitely the way to go. I also tend to look at the tender valuation process itself, because that gives me some key information as well. They'll always tell you what the selection criteria are. If they don't give you a response schedule, then, and if you have a look at the structure, in many times they'll give you the structure of the RFT, and they'll tell you what to do with each section. In this case, they're saying read and keep these sections, and then section E, we've given you a response schedule. That's really super handy, because the response schedule will be laid out in accordance with the evaluation checklist. And so they're telling you exactly how they want it submitted. If you don't get any response schedules, then the place to look is in the selection criteria section. There'll be some compliance criteria and then some qualitative criteria. And the qualitative criteria is basically the headings for the submission, where you put your response. So if they're going to evaluate you on your capability, then, and your financial viability and your relevant skills and your experience and your quality systems and your employee relations, you need to address every single one of those in your response. So each one of those becomes a heading in the response. But fortunately, they've given us a response schedule to help you with that process. The other thing I look for, I mean, a lot of this is just boilerplate stuff. It's very, very similar and common across all of the all companies. You might want to look at, let me see, just flicking back quickly to the contact officers. Now, during the tender open period, these are the only guys you are allowed to communicate with during the tender open process. You can't go to the chairman of the board or your mate in another section and ask questions about the tender, because if they find out, they will strike you out, no question, and you will have lost it before you even began. So these guys are kind of important. The other thing that's very important, if we go forward to this timetable, they'll tell you often when you have to submit your questions to them. So there will be some clarification questions. And typically, they don't like receiving clarification questions close to the closing deadline. The reason is it takes them time to respond, which eats into your time. And you may actually ask a question that's fundamental to the type of response and how everyone's going to position themselves. And if you give it to them in the last week, it may mean that they go, oh, damn, we hadn't thought of that. Oh, we're going to have to give everyone an extension. So get your questions in early, preferably within the first week of you receiving it. Now, I also look for a section on alternate tenders. Generally speaking, they will accept an alternate bid, which means that you've decided that although they've want it done this way, you can give them better value for money if you do it that way. If that's the case, they generally want a conforming tender as well, which means you have to submit 2 tenders. You can't just give them the alternate because they won't accept it. They'll throw it out as being non-compliant. So do read this and see what their policy is around alternate tenders. Personally, I've never seen an example where they've just gone, okay, give us an alternate tender without submitting a compliant bid. Never seen that. What else do we need to know? The other thing that I would look for in here, and it's not in this particular one, but I would look where you talk about tender submissions. There may be a section that says you can't change the format of the response schedule. What that means is you can't change the font, you can't change the layout, you can't change the headings, you can't change anything. You have to give them their response schedule back to them with your content in it. I've seen that a few times, and that means that you can't brand it, you can't put your logo on it, you can't do any of that, and that puts you at a disadvantage. If you don't see that, then feel free to brand the response schedule as much as you like. The one thing I would say though, and I'll repeat this in future videos I'm sure, is don't change the order. So that's the conditions of tendering. Let's go through and also, okay, so then they'll often give you conditions of contract. Sometimes they'll give you a link to their boilerplate conditions of contract, which they'll have on their website somewhere. If they offer you example conditions of contract, well, read them, and you will be asked to specify any departures you have with those clauses. They will be boilerplate 90% of the time. The other 10% of the time, they will be specifically drafted by lawyers for that bid. It's not likely that you would encounter that if you're going for fairly simple tenders. Somewhere in the document will be a statement of what they're actually buying, what they want. In this document, it's called a statement of requirements, but in other documents, it might be called a scope or a scope of work or a specification. Sometimes it's embedded in a document, sometimes it's a separate document, and other times it's a schedule at the back. This actually tells you what it is that they're after. So you would obviously have a read of this to make sure that you can provide it. Now, a couple of things to watch out for. Make sure the requirement should use the term contractor because it applies to whoever they select and who starts the work. Make sure there's nothing in here that says the proponent or the tenderer must provide, because that means that they're telling you that you need to submit certain documentation and a certain response to a certain requirement as part of your tender, as part of your bid, and they've buried it in their scope. So make sure that there's no hidden gotchas in the statement of requirements that you have to submit as part of your actual tendering process. If it says contractor, don't worry. It'll talk in some cases around things like safety, for example. The contractor must submit a safety management plan within 3 months of commencement. They may also ask for a draft as part of the tender process. So just watch out for things like that. Moving through this, here's an example of the response schedules. So see, it says complete and return this section. In other cases, there is no response schedule, so you have to kind of figure it out. And that's why I said go to and look at the evaluation criteria. Just a word of warning, if you have a response schedule, even if it's a separate document, you might find it's really super buggy because it's been copied over and reused and reused and reused, and it becomes full of different styles, and as a document to work in on as it is presented to you, it may be really buggy. And so you're better off taking the content in here and putting it into a clean template so that you don't copy across all of the conflicting styles and so on. Sometimes when they send you the response schedules, they're a PDF. So just go back to them and say, can we please have a Word document so that you can work with the content. The response schedule or the evaluation criteria, what you'll find is that this closely matches the evaluation criteria that were provided in the conditions of tendering. The compliance criteria, your response to this should be a yes or a no. Now, what this means is that if you say yes when you should have said no, they may use that as an opportunity to strike you out. If you don't respond to the compliance criteria, so here's a tip, always when you start responding, get the compliance criteria filled and out of the way first, so you don't forget to do them later, because if you miss any question in the compliance criteria, they may strike you out as non-compliant. Often they'll provide a checklist, which is super handy. Just keep that to one side and then go through it at the end and make sure that you have given them everything that they've asked for. So the compliance criteria are relatively quick to respond to. As I said, get it done quickly. Just fill these out. And then the qualitative criteria, if you have a look at this response schedule, they've told you what the qualitative criteria are, and in this case, they've also kindly told you how they've weighted them in terms of importance. So local content is only worth 5%, so it should have 5% of your attention. Organisational capability and technical capability, they're telling you they are more important to them in terms of how they're going to weight your response. And so they will point score everything that you give them back. That point scoring is how well you have responded to the criteria and how well you've convinced them that you can do the job really well. So if it's got a weighting of 20%, then make sure that you give them more than a couple of lines or a paragraph. Make sure that you give them a good, thorough response. They may give you tables to fill out. Make sure you fill out those tables. So if we look at this for key personnel skills and experience, the tenderer shall nominate the intended position and name of each employee who will be associated with the contract in either a management or supervisory capacity, down to and including foreman supervisor level. So this table, I'll cover this in future videos, but this table is the minimum that they ask for. Minimum. You need to give them more than this because they want to know this information, but then there's more you can tell them that they haven't asked for. It's a bit of a trick. So those companies who just give them the bare minimum fail to impress. That's all I'm going to say. See how they've got a box here? So this is criteria, key input, cost control strategy, blah, 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 and a box. That box is where you submit your response. Now, boxes are really super hard to work in, so you don't have to fill that box out. You can delete that box and just put your text underneath. I tend to use a different color, so it differentiates their question from our response. So that's the response schedules. And you can see in this case, they're very, very detailed. And then there will always be a price section where they talk about how they want you to price it. And then typically there will be a table like here, or maybe even a spreadsheet. So this is your instructions on how to fill out the price. And then you go to the spreadsheet or use the table that they've given you in the Word document. So that's all there is to know about the invitation to tender document. We'll talk about more in future videos.